Okay, hello. Today is the birthday of Paolo Portoghesi. He was born in 1931 on the 2nd of November, so he is 91 years old today. Let's wish him happy birthday. So Paolo Portoghesi, born, as I said, November 2nd, 1931 in Rome, is an Italian architect, theorist, historian, and professor of architecture at the University La Sapienza in Rome. He's a former president of the architectural section of the Venice Biennial 1979-1992. So he actually directed the Venice Biennial for 13 years, editor-in-chief of the journal Controspazio 1969-1983. So for 14 years, he led the journal Controspazio, and the dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the Politecnico di Milano 1968-1978. So for 10 years, he was the dean in Milano. Portoghesi studied architecture at the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Rome, completing his studies in 1957. He began teaching the history of criticism at the same faculty in 1961. Portoghesi opened an architectural practice with architect-engineer Vittorio Gigliotti, born in 1921 in Rome in 1964. He has specialized in teaching and researching classical architecture, especially Baroque architecture, and in particular Borromini, but also Michelangelo. His interest in more contemporary architecture coincided largely with that of his colleague in Rome, Bruno Zevi, in championing a more organic form of modernism, evident in, for instance, the work of Victor Horta and Frank Lloyd Wright, and in Italy with neorealism and the liberty style. This attitude has continued throughout Portoghesi's career and is clearly visible in his own architecture. It is also evident in his concern for the studies of nature, brought to the fore in his more recent book, Nature and Architecture, from the year 2000. Here is the man when he was younger, of course. Here he is in his older age, but still, I would say, a handsome man. And here in a romantic posture. As I told Bogdan, I worked for several months in his office in Rome, so I know him personally. Yes. So some drawings by Paolo Portoghesi, sketches for various buildings. So a man of great intellect and great knowledge, and he didn't, restrict himself to the field of theory, but also build. Sometimes better, sometimes maybe a little less, but also the amplitude of his concerns was not very fashionable, and perhaps even today is not very fashionable. I wonder what he would have done, since the arrival of the computer in the architecture world. But I think he did some work, helped by digital technology too. But maybe around 10 years ago, he left Rome and went to the country with his wife. He worked sometimes with, so again, these are just drawings, but diagrams, but we'll go then, in detail to the built work. I remember when my first job in his office was for the Institute of Philosophy or Philosophical Studies in Berlin, the Italian, I forgot exactly the name of the building, something like this, like Institute of Philosophical Research or Institute of Philosophy, an Italian one, but in Germany. And I remember I was working in the interior design, and I was, you know, playing with the desks and the chairs, the furniture within the classrooms. And he asked me to be freer. I was placing those pieces of furniture as the schools are in Romania, but he was against rigidity and aligned desks and so on. He wanted, like you see in this diagram, and he built buildings in this way. He was not happy with the Cartesianism, so to speak. Well, kind of normal now when we consider that he was and is very, very interested in the Baroque architecture, and the Baroque architecture in Italy, and maybe particularly Rome, is highly significant. If we are to mention just Bernini and Borromini and Pietro da Cortona. So this is, he actually built it, a Center for Islamic Culture in Rome, quite large, and you are going to see it. So let's look at some of his built works. Casa Baldi in Rome, 1959. I like this building very much. Again, I think his early works are his best, because he was able to marry history with modernity, and the earlier works were not affected by what we call postmodernism. This is the building, and you can see the canopy that the influence in a way of the Baroque architecture, but also in the curvature of the walls which are not plastered, which is a good thing. And this is, he based the plan of the house on this diagram. And you see these are the walls of the house. So there is a system, but it's a system generated by playing, in this case, with curves, with circles and fragments of circles. I think it's a good building. And so again, built in 1957, 1959. So it has more than 60 years, the age of this building. And I like the materials he used. You see how the walls were built, and it's sophisticated, it's cultured, it's educated. It's an educated building, if we can say so, but it's also some, I don't know if I could call it primitive, is because of the materials that are employed for the masonry walls. And this conjunction between nature and architecture that culminated with him publishing a book called Nature and Architecture is present in various ways in his work. No, this is a good building. And, when you think that around that time, there was the influence of the international style. North America exported its vision of modernity. This was rather, I would say, rather unique for that time, 1960. Casa Baldi, 1959, Paolo Portoghesi. He laughed, of course, Bruno Taut, and it shows. I remember when I left his office, I gave him as a present 2 drawings that I did in ink in the spirit of Bruno Taut, and he liked them very much. And he gave me a book, as a present. This was a long time ago, 1982, in February. Oh, I don't know what it is here, a party of some sort. So the house is not so small, but it's not big either. And these are, this is the second floor. So even if he used curves, you see these curves are controlled by, I mean, rigorously by, knowing the center of the circle they would have been part of. So, there is also control. It's not just, playing with forms without any form of control. There is maybe a little bit too much from my point of view, but anyway, a good building, a good early building by Paolo Portoghesi. I also like the stair and look at the handrail. This is it is modern, but it's also old in a way. It's of course there is the influence or the echo coming from Victor Horta, the Art Nouveau, architect. Uh, it's a sensitive house that is done also with the knowledge of the history of architecture, the history of modernity. It's not a brutally modern building. It's a building that is sensitive, it's cultured, it's educated, but it's not pedantic. Exactly because he was wise enough and courageous enough not to hide the process of building the walls, and even leave concrete, raw, I mean, exposed. When I worked in his office, there was also the son of Christian Norberg Schulz. Well, they used to be friends, I think, Christian Norberg Schulz with Paolo Portoghesi. So you probably know of Christian Norberg Schulz. He wrote some influential books about that period, but himself, Christian Norberg Schulz, was very knowledgeable and published books about Baroque and late Baroque and Rococo architecture. But in my opinion, the Baroque spirit, and I know it's kind of a paradox, or if not a contradiction, but in the present, there are certain insinuations of a Baroque aspiration or mentality, even if on the other hand, we are confronted with all kinds of crises, the energy crisis, the climate change, sustainability. So, but the Baroque seems to be relevant somehow for our time. And there are some architects who could be described, in my opinion, as being Baroque. Like, for example, Frank Gehry, who was in fact highly inspired by Bernini, could be considered a contemporary Baroque architect in a neurotical way, perhaps, at least in some buildings. But there is a Baroque mentality at work. And myself, I have an interest in the Baroque architects. I love Borromini. I even organized an exhibition called Angst Baroque in Vienna in 2017 with works neo-Baroque done at the Institute of Architecture in Vienna. And I brought drafting boards from Mincu in Bucharest, and also the supports, the metallic supports from Bucharest with a van all the way to Vienna, and the works, the projects were displayed on those old wooden drafting boards from Mincu. It was nice, I think. But this building is nice too. And the interior, you see, look at this, if he was a pedantic architect, he would have tried to hide this away. He didn't, and I'm glad he didn't. So he brought in a way, the past, the process of building the building, and insinuations of how the building might become, even the ruin itself. So there are various aspects in this building. There is this rather interesting stair, and then various materials, this exposed brickwork. I like this building because it is modern, but it's not only modern. It also connects with a certain past and also with the history of architecture. Uh, Even the furniture he employed is, the typical contemporary furniture of the time when the building was built. And look at the ceiling here. As you can see, it's not a big house. I mean, we know much larger buildings than this one, private residences. And then, of course, the landscape is magnificent, but he was not the author of the landscape, those beautiful trees, and the beautiful light in Rome is just so inspiring. Another house, Casa Andres Candrilia, 1964. I don't know if I have enough pictures here, but even this picture, and I wish I had a better resolution for this picture, but it's still rather interesting. He employed concrete, and we are going to see some very good work done for a chapel, also in concrete. That's what I say. His early works are clearly modern, but not only modern, but there is this robust rawness of the concrete, which I find it stimulating. Too bad concrete pollutes, but at that time there wasn't concern with pollution. The interior is warm and even cozy, but also engaging in spatial terms. This is a strange picture now, but you see, look at the building. It is a modern building, of course, but then you have the sheep in front of the building. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that the shepherd lived in that building now. It's probably someone else. This building also, this is the plan. So the plan is also generated by these circles, and you see he was interested in finding some kind of a balance between order and disorder. The order is generated by controlling through geometry, yes, circles, and then the choice of this so-called control is actually could be considered as rather capricious. But I kept saying that capriciousness is part of an artist's job. It doesn't matter. You cannot totally be. It's impossible and even not desirable to be totally objective. Another house, Casa Bevilacqua, 1964. Again, concrete, modern work. I truly think his early works are his best. We are going to see some of his later works as well. Interesting also this treatment of the facades, this fragmentation, very musical. It's almost like an organ, and it's done with simple means, just those tubes, metallic tubes, and the fence as well. Paolo Portoghesi. A theater, 1965, Theater of Cagliari, but no pictures. I thought I had, let me see. No, sorry, I guess I couldn't find pictures. I made this presentation 2 years ago and I forgot I didn't find pictures for Theater of Cagliari, but we'll go to Casa Papanice, Roma, 1966. Now, even this interior is not a typical modern interior at all. You know, he certainly welcomed ornament and color. So we don't have just, you know, straight white walls. And the ceiling also has its own importance in the configuration of the space and of the architecture. And this is the plan. We actually saw a few pictures of this building previously. You remember my comments about the organ. Those pictures should have been here. Sorry, they were misplaced a few slides before. He had a vision. He had a personality in his architecture. There is a certain femininity, a feminine sensitivity, I would say, in his work. Now, this man, well, you know, led the Politecnico in Milano for 10 years. So he was obviously very capable also. And I didn't mention, you know, the many years he was actually the main, you know, force, so to speak, in the Venice Biennial from 1979. I thought that it started in 1982, but it seems it started 3 years earlier. So this is another house by him. Interesting, these, you know, balconies, you know, there is a certain peculiarity in his architecture, you know, the way he extended the interior space towards the outside through these you know, small balconies of a rather private character. You see the balconies here. So he was, because they died, both Aldo Rossi and Carlos Scarpa. But he was, you know, although Aldo Rossi and Carlos Scarpa were associated with Venice, they taught at the Faculty of Architecture in Venice, while Portoghesi was in Rome. But they were part of that, and there were other architects, of course. Italy had an abundance of interesting and important architects. He was part of that, you know, and it's important to have a climate of, you know, originality and research and interesting architectures being built. It's stimulating. Now this one, this church of Sacra Familia, the Sacred Family, no, Sagrada Familia, if we are to recall Gaudi in Barcelona. This is in Salerno, 1969. And concrete through and through, modernistic through and through, but the interior has certain spatial modulations. I don't know how to call them. You see here his methodology also employed with these circles, and then generating the space of the inside of the interior, by manipulating fragments of these traces based on certain circles with various diameters. The interior is spectacular, and the exterior is also, I would say, interesting enough. But the interior I like because it is, it suggests some kind of a womb, and probably appropriately so. And I like the ceiling. It's not that it has a certain drama, and this helps. It's a good building, this church. Concrete, a lot of concrete, yes. Sacred Family Church, Paolo Portoghesi, 1960, I forgot, 1969 or so. He was different from Carlos Scarpa, although Carlos Scarpa in the Brion Cemetery used also concrete, but they are different. There are certain points of intersection, but Portoghesi is Portoghesi and Carlos Scarpa was Carlos Scarpa. Royal Court, Amman, Jordan, 1973. I don't know if he built this. No, I don't think he did. It's just a project, but it could have been an interesting building or a cluster of buildings, but it was not built in Jordan. But he had he built interesting buildings, or had a concern for serving also, religious. I mean, after all, he built, as I said, the Center for Islamic Culture in Rome, which is, of course, the city of Christianity, of Catholic Christianity. Is the Pope is there, and the Vatican is there, and San Pietro is there. So let's look at the Mosque of Rome. Actually, when I was in his office was in the very building where he lived on Via Gregoriana, just a few meters away from Trinidad dei Monti, that is at the top of the Spanish stairs. And I was working, well, he had like two offices, one above the other. Underneath the office where I worked, people were working, architects were working on the Mosque of Rome, which you are going to see now. It began the project in 1974, but I was there in 1981, and they were still working on the Mosque of Rome. And he was living above the office where I was working. The office where I was working was actually an apartment, where it was an apartment building. So he would take the elevator and unite his own apartment where he lived with his wife and then descend like a god, to the offices that belong to him. Rather malicious, someone inscribed on the wall at the entrance of the building. It was written Studio Paolo Portoghesi, but someone erased the first two letters, the first three letters, STU. So it remained just Dio Paolo Portoghesi. This is what I remember. This is the ceiling of the and the roofing of the mosque in Rome. I think it's good. Was good in intentions, bringing the labyrinth, to architecture. But I don't know. Towards the outside, I think the building, for my taste, is a little bit static. And it seems it's almost like a little bit neglected, or the details were not properly resolved. I don't know, but inside there are interesting things happening. Maybe here is an echo of Il Campidoglio in Rome, the famous design for that square by Michelangelo. And look at the interior. Again, this was now in late 70s, early 80s. Well, postmodernism began to assert itself, and maybe it's felt here as well. But there are interesting things. The problem is, and I think there is a problem, some of the spontaneity, maybe he couldn't be as modern as he would have liked, as he was in the church we just saw. And there is something didactic and a little bit decorative here, which I think would have disturbed someone like Kenneth Frampton. But how many architects at that time, and in our time as well? Well, in the present, strangely perhaps, someone like Zaha Hadid, she was moving in this direction in a way, towards an increasingly ornamental parametry. But here, before parametry, we see the concerns of Paolo Portoghesi for, I mentioned the labyrinth, for ornament. Maybe if I am to become more lyrical, the foliage of the tree. Too bad that this is not really expressed towards the outside. At that time, they were not working with computers. So you see, this was a rendering done, manually. I would have liked personally to see some qualities of the interior space to be reflected towards the outside. For some reason, it didn't happen. It's rather predictable, this facade of the building, for my taste. You see, there is a change between the church we just saw and this building. There is a church. Maybe that change had to do also with the client, the requirements of the client is possible. Academy of Fine Arts, L'Aquila, but the change kept manifesting itself. Something happened. I continue to think that his early works are the best in his oeuvre. Here, it's okay, I guess, but a little bit didactic and a little bit predictable, this architecture, I think. I think postmodernism had a, well, it had a fatal effect on many architects, and I think he didn't escape the dangers of postmodernism either. Condominium from 1981, Tarquinia. No picture though. Tagal residence. I took this list of buildings from Wikipedia, but not all of them I was able, not all of them were illustrated, or I couldn't find images. IBA, International Building, I don't know how to translate. Berlin had 3 events of this sort. Berlin was wise enough to invite famous architects in 1930s, in 1950s, and in 1980s to build blocks of flats, mainly in the city. And he was invited in also in Berlin in the 80s, and this is the building he built. That's why I have only one image, because I'm not very convinced about this building, but you know, it still stands out somehow. It is postmodern through and through, but a little more, less superficially than the postmodernism practiced by many other architects. Le Terme di Montecatini in Pistoia, 1987. Here we are very close to an architect he actually admired, that is Imre Makovec, or Makovec. His birthday is in November as well, a Hungarian architect about whom I will talk, you know, I don't know, two weeks later or something like this. I think he was born on the same day with Kenneth Frampton. I don't think Kenneth Frampton would be happy about this, because I don't think he likes Imre Makovec, but he was an interesting Hungarian architect, and I know Portoghesi appreciated Imre Makovec, and here, through his work, this work is connects somehow with the works of Imre Makovec. Now, what do we see here? Maybe the forest of columns that a poet like Hölderlin talked about. The forest of columns, where the columns become trees in a way, abstracted to an extent, but still, you know, it's not so difficult to imagine architectural trees somehow looking at these columns. Of course, architecture can happen in many ways. There is an infinity of possibilities. This is one of them. There are others. It's important, I think, to be rigorous and to be strict, but also to be free and to investigate and to experiment and to create buildings that belong to, in a deep way, to what you think and feel, what you stand for. La Politeana Theatre, Catanzaro, a later work. Again, I state what I already did, that for me, his early works, his first 3 or 4 buildings that I showed at the beginning, are less static and more convincing. His later works are a little bit, for my taste, a little bit predictable in the, you know, symmetry and, you know, I don't see much of an adventure here. I think a good architecture is also at least in modernity, an adventure, a pioneering work. Now, in this case, he was dealing with an existing building, which he tried to, to reconfigure in a way. But behind this was an existing building, I think. This skyscraper, I always liked, and I so regret it was not built. Well, it's not really a skyscraper. It doesn't arrive to the so-called sky because it's not so tall, but it's still an original. And when you think when it was made, like 50 years ago, if not 60, it's rather unique. I mean, there are other architects who played with cubes, and especially these days. But here is more than that. You see vertical windows. We see vertical bow windows, narrow and tall. These are not at all typical. Most towers today are just covered in glass, although sustainability issues and the energy crisis should make us think twice about using, curtain walls and so on. But this building is, yeah, it's very bad it was not built. It would have been very interesting. It's also Piranesian somehow, and I see Borges here somehow. There is a sensitivity which is distinct and almost puzzling for a modernity which became dogmatic, especially in the case of towers. Again, too bad it was not built. But architecture, I think, benefits also from buildings which were not built. Because if you make an interesting project, an interesting model, interesting plans and sections and drawings in general, for the spirit of architecture, they could mean something. They are not irrelevant. They belong to architecture. Some people like Peter Eisenman even think that a drawing, an architectural drawing, is more important than the built work. I am not so convinced about this, but there are people who think in this way. So, you can serve architecture in various ways. If you don't have clients and commissions, you can still make projects for competitions or make proposals for the city you live in, and contribute to the spirit of architecture in whatever form is available to you. La Piazza Leon Battista Alberti in Rimini in 1990. I don't know. I mean, but at that time also Riccardo Bofill and Thaler de Architectura were building things kind of in this spirit. Static and symmetrical, and yeah, postmodernism, in my opinion, didn't have a good effect on many architects. But who knows? Maybe the perception could change. We are all not enslaved, but inspired or conditioned by the time we live in. Actually, when I was in his office, similar blocks of flats were conceived and drawn, because I remember with these arches, and I did myself because, there is an influence coming from various parts. I did some drawings with this kind of, I think they are a little, I think I understand now why I was carrying with me an issue of the Romanian magazine Arhitectura with a city hall built in Baia Mare by Mircea Alifanti and Adrian Panaitescu, his assistant, or anyway, his collaborator at the time. And I showed that magazine to Paolo Portoghesi, and he looked with interest, but he told me it's so primitive. I never felt that that building was primitive. But if something is missing here, in my opinion, is exactly that, some primitivism, if we are to call it so. It's too conscious, self-conscious, and too, in a way, didactic and too symmetrical and even too, timid. I mean, look at this. Anyway, he tried. He tried to do something, and he did. The table, we see his liking for the curved wood. The chapel of Don Giuseppe Rizzo in Alcamo, 1995. No picture. Church of Santa Maria della Pace, Terni. No pictures. I think I'm approaching the end of the presentation with no pictures because I couldn't find them. Or who knows? No, I couldn't find them, but maybe this time I should have searched again. Chiesa Madonna della Pace, Valenza. Here we see something. The ceiling and the roofing is interesting. Because it has a certain drama, and sculpturalness is important for architecture. Grand Mosque in Strasbourg. He built another mosque in Strasbourg, in France, in the year 2000s. This one is rather strange. I mean, a serious theoretician or critic would never use the word strange, but I don't know how to describe it, actually. It's look at these things. Yes, they have a role in the structure of the building, but maybe it's a reference to the new moon. I mean, it's a mosque, but also I don't know. Yeah, I find them a little bit strange, and particularly this. But it is still somehow an interesting building, almost unique, maybe because of its idiosyncrasies. In a way, it's a difficult building, although, I mean, for perceiving it or evaluating it critically. Although it appears to be not so complicated, I don't know. I'm really puzzled by this building. So he built two mosques, and rather large buildings, the one in Rome and the one in Strasbourg. Yeah, maybe that's the connection with what is here. But what bothers me a little is this base, this pedestal, in a way, of two floors. Is, I don't know. Maybe the requirements of the program. Well, I'm not sure, because I had seen. In fact, I saw. I think for this very. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if for this particular. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's see if Zaha Hadid was not doing herself up. Yes, yes. So let's look again at the building built by Paolo Portoghesi. He built it, but Zaha Hadid did herself a project for this place and for this program, for this mosque. Personally, I like more the work proposed by Zaha Hadid, but it was not built, unfortunately, in my opinion. So this is in Strasbourg, a very important city for the European Union. And now we look at her project for the same thing, for the Strasbourg Mosque. I don't know, I find it more, now, of course, we are accustomed to her way of doing buildings and things. But this one, I find it, less conditioned by, certain predictable ways of doing architecture. Here is a, almost tempestuous élan vital, and is done as it is. It was not accepted, but I think it would have been a more original building. Although looking back, of course, Zaha Hadid did many buildings that are, specifically Zaha Hadid buildings, and maybe in that context, this is not so surprising. In a way, maybe it's more surprising the building by Paolo Portoghesi. The Rinascimento in Talenti Park, Rome, 2001 is an apartment building, condominiums. You see his liking of the Baroque, interpreted for 20 years ago, for the year 2000s. I like the way he eroded this facade. It's almost like, this is like a large-scale erosion of otherwise blank facade. So he excavated or excavated, if there is such a word, within that wall. And then that's how those windows came into being. But this thing at the top, I understand the references, historicist references, but I find it rather weak and again, decorative. The Montpellier Gardens in France, no pictures, Torre del Respiro at Shanghai. Here he worked with Marco Basili, and here he worked with digital, some digital technology. We are already in the 21st century, but it was not built, this work. Here they are, Portoghesi on the right and Marco on the left, with a tower which again was not built. And here he is in the country, enjoying having a bird on his shoulder. And yeah, maybe most architects should do this, leave the city and enjoy the country life and the proximity of, some animals, birds, or otherwise, flowers, plants, and serve less the continuously challenging and domineering urban environment, which is ravishing the earth in a way. Maybe we should all follow Paolo Portoghesi to the country, because I do believe that the village is the future. Town Hall Square in Germany, this is a sculpture, kind of a sculptural work. I don't know what its function is. It's a point of interest, something to, I don't think is commemorating anything, or I don't know, but this is what he built in Germany. Headquarters of the Royalties Institute, St. Peter's College, Oxford, UK, no pictures. Public Square, Shanghai, China, 2006, no pictures. Cimitero Nuovo di Cesena, 2011, no pictures. Sorry about this, I couldn't find them, but I think we still covered a lot of his works. and we have a certain, understanding of what Paolo Portoghesi created. Now we look at the end of this presentation at some of the books he published. I was telling you about this book, Nature and Architecture, which is a very nice book. I almost said perhaps a little bit too nice and a little bit too predictable, the relationship between architecture, which is at the bottom, and nature, which is at the top. Too literal somehow, the similarities are too literal, I think. But the goal of the book is good, to show possible relationships between nature and architecture. His beloved Francesco Borromini, The Rome of Borromini, architecture as language, a book by Paolo Portoghesi. He is a great connoisseur of Borromini. Now a book that he published, where he wrote about Victor Horta, and some echoes of Horta's work can be found also in his work. A very important Belgian architect, Victor Horta. Then Paolo Portoghesi, architect by Francesca Gottardo. As a man of culture, as an architect who was and is an intellectual, books are very important for him, and books about him, and books he wrote himself. So this man who drew and built also was very connected with the art of writing. And I recommend, I suggest to read some text by him, because for someone like Kenneth Frampton, Paolo Portoghesi is more important as an intellectual architect and as a critic and theorist than as a builder. That's what Frampton thought. But, the future might decide about this better. Au-delà de l'architecture moderne, beyond the modern architecture, of course, his own efforts are kind of part in this sense. Here we see Aldo Rossi with his Teatro del Mundo, and Venice, of course. And Paolo Portoghesi, The Architecture of Listening, someone entitled, so the title of the book, The Architecture of Listening. Usually architects don't listen too much, but for this author, it seems Paolo Portoghesi is listening. I don't know. That was what he thought. And again, Borromini with a beautiful photograph on the cover. Yes, a great architect. Borromini, who was in a tensioned relationship with Bernini, and some even think he committed suicide at 68 because of the unhappiness of that relationship, tension, not to say conflictual relationship with Bernini. Bernini, who, as I said, inspired someone like Frank Gehry today. And I said that he had a liking and an interest in Imre Makovic, whose birthday will be this month, and I will talk about him, Hungarian architect, and he wrote about him, as you can see. And The Hand of Palladio, another book, The Hand of Palladio. Rome of the Renaissance, Paolo Portoghesi. That's it. So let's wish him happy birthday. Let's hope he will be next year 92 years old. Thank you.